Okay, here we go. Talk to Haley Gemara. Make sure it's sharing properly. Okay, we are at the bottom of the Qaf on the base. Talk to Haley Mishnah. Ein maskirin lohem bottom Eretz Yisrael. You're not allowed to rent a home to a guy in Eretz Yisrael. Vein tzar chalomer sodes, and you're surely not allowed to rent a field. Now, why is a field worse? The Gemara is going to shortly explain. Is because in addition to the problem of giving the goyim a foothold in Eretz Yisrael, you're also allowing them to battle the maestros, the chiv maestros, because they don't bring meiser. The intar chloimer salis uva Surya. Now Surya Rashi says is Aram Tzaiba, which is Syria, was smuchal Eretz Yisrael. It's very near to it, but it's not Eretz Yisrael. The Chibsha David Hamelach captured Aram Tzaiba, the Chibra Lekadushas Eretz Yisrael, and he annexed it to be part of Eretz Yisrael. And the fact that it's a contingent land plays a factor in making it work, but it's shaloi al pi adibur. But it wasn't al pi the tzivei of the Rebbeinu Shalom, ubeloi shisham ribui, and it didn't have 600,000 eat. Not everyone was there. Therefore, it's referred to in the Gemara as something called kibush yachid. So, what is the halacha with Surya? It's not really midarais, it's part of Eretz Yisrael. So let's turn over to today's daf. Surya maskirin lehavot. You are allowed to rent homes to goyim, and Rashi says in Eretz Yisrael where goyis are schira, but you're not going to schira in Surya. The inami asil de mechira. Even if you would sell a house to a guy in Aram Tzeva, you would still not be over the deraisa. So, because the Israel Lasit Lemchein is Chania in Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael you can, but in Syria, which is not the deraisa part of Eretz Yisrael, you're allowed to sell. Therefore, you're allowed to rent. But you still shouldn't rent a field to a guy. Rashi says the surah because we also have the issue of mices. Okay, weiter. So there's three levels. There's Israel, there's Syria, and there's Chutzlaretz. You're allowed to sell them houses because there's no issue of giving them a foothold. And you rent them fields, but you don't sell fields to them. Again, because the kivin the ikatarti, not only is there a potential problem of giving them a foothold, there's also the issue of if they're cultivating those properties, there's no maishas on them. Divi Rebbe Meir. Rabbi Yosy makes everything less chumradik by one notch. So Be'eretz Yisrael maskirin lambatim avalei sadais. In Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yosy even allows you to rent them a home. You're not selling it to them; you're renting it to them. But sadais you're not allowed to rent. Uva again, one level down, moichrim batim. You're allowed to sell them homes. Not only are you allowed to rent them homes, you're allowed to sell them homes. Maskir and sadais, then you could rent them fields. You're allowed to sell anything to a guy in Chutz La'aretz. Now, Zok the Mishnah, we're assuming in this part of the Mishnah that there are some places where you wouldn't be allowed to rent, and there are certain places where you would be allowed to rent. So right away, the Gemara is going to tell us that this can't be according to Rabbi Yosy, because according to Rabbi Yosy, you could rent them anything, you could rent them anywhere. So it must be going according to Rabbi Meir, who holds Some places you could rent, some places you can't rent. But even in a place where you could rent, loy leveis dira amru, you're not allowed to rent them a home to live in. You could rent it to them to use as a storehouse, as a warehouse, but not to live in. And we learned this Mishnah already. It was quoted earlier in the Masechta. Because a guy brings Avoda Zara into a house, and if you own the house that they're renting, they'll bring Avoda Zara into it. Shenemar lo yisavi to'eva el veisecha. You're not allowed to bring a to'eva into your house. V'chol makom lo yasker lo yisamerchatz. And no matter where you are, oretz v'chutz la'aretz, you're not allowed to rent a merchatz to them. Mipnei shu nikra shemoi. Because if that's operated on Shabbos, people are going to think that a Yid's operating on Shabbos, because a merchatz is always identified as after the owner of the property, and it'll look like he's operating a merchatz on Shabbos. Marisain. Okay, gewaltig. Zog de heilige Gemara. Mai ein tzarich loimer sados. Why does the Gemara assume that sados is more severe? Whatever you're not allowed to do with a bias, you're surely not allowed to do in the southern. Ilema mishum the isba tarti. If it's because there's two reasons to answer. Chada, reason number one is chanias karka. You're not allowed to give the goyim a foothold in Eretz Yisrael. And the chada, the kamaf alomi meiser, that a goy is not going to give meisers. There's a shaila, there's shaylim, it won't give meisers, or it'll be positive for meisers. But if that's the case, ihachi batim nami. So then, by the same reason, for the same token, you should answer the rental of homes as well. Why? Because ikatarpi, there's also two things. Chada number one is chanias karka. You're giving them a foothold in the land. The chada, and reason number two is the kamafkal of the mezuzah. Their house they're living in, they won't put a mezuzah on. So it's taking away the mitzvah of mezuzah. Zok to Gemara, that's not a comparison at all. Amar Rab Masharshay, mezuzah is chayvas hadorhu. The mezuzah has nothing to do, the chiv mezuzah has nothing to do with the house. It's not like a din in the house. It's a din in the person who lives in the house for his own shmirah. It's a mitzvah that he has to put up a mezuzah. Actually, he has to put up a mezuzah because it's a mitzvah. If he balti is the mitzvah, he gets a shmirah. But al kolponim, you're not being mevatel anything because the chiv and you doesn't change. However, when it comes to chiv maishus, that's a din on your karka. It's a din on your karka that whatever grows on your karka is from chiv maishus, and therefore by a soda it's much worse. Okay, gewaltig. Zog to Gemara weiter. Besurya maskirin batam. Zog to Gemara maish no mechira deloy. Why is it that we don't allow a mechira, selling of a home in Syria? Because mishum de mechira the Eretz Yisrael, where geyser mechira in Syria, which there's no problem of chinia, to mechira in Eretz Yisrael, where there is a problem of chinia. So, frank to Gemara, if you're being geyser Syria auto Eretz Yisrael, so then the hachi mischiris nami nigzar, you should make a gzera for schiris as well, because if you allow a guy to rent your property in Chutz La'aretz, you allow him to rent it in Eretz Yisrael, and if he rents it in Eretz Yisrael, he might buy it in Eretz Yisrael. So Yehochim Yischiris Nami Nixer, Nami Nixer, after the Gemara, he gufa Gzera. The whole reason why even in Eretz Yisrael, Schiris is also, is only a Gzera because you might come to sell it to a guy. V'hanan Nekum, the Nixer Gzera L'Gzera, but we should make a Gzera on it in the Gzera. We don't do that. To Gemara, what about Maschiris Tzada? What about renting a field in Syria, the Besurya? Beiter it's Gzera L'Gzera, because you're only answering Schiris of a Sada in Syria, Atu Schiris of a Sada in Eretz Yisrael. And even Schiris of a Sada in Eretz Yisrael is not Asr, it's only Asr Atu Mechira. The Kagazrin, and yet you still ask for Schiris Sada Besurya. Dr. Gemara, Chasam Lav Gzerahu. There, it's not a Gzera. The reason why it's Asr to sell a field or to rent a field in Syria is because Kosover Kibush Yachot Shemei Kibush, the Omar who holds that it's also to rent a field in Syria holds that it is part of Eretz Yisrael. He holds that Surya is part of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore, Soda the Ispeitarti, Soda, where there's two problems. Sa, you're being a mafkiyat from Maestros, and Sa, you're giving them a foothold in what's legally Eretz Yisrael, because Surya is legally Eretz Yisrael if you hold Kibush Shachot Shmei Kibush. So Soda the Ispeitarti, Gozu Berabonon, their Gozer Atu Mechira in Surya, which would be also Midaraisa. But bottom, the less Lebuhutarti, by bottom, there's no two reasons, there's only one reason. Al Chanin et Yisrael, like Gozer B'Rabbanon, they weren't Gozer Schiros Atu Mechira. Beautiful. Beautiful. Zog to Gemara Vayt. B'chutz La'aretz. So in Chutz La'aretz, what do the Tanakama say? Moichin Lahem Botim Umaskirin Lahem Sadis. You could only rent them a field. Zog to Gemara, Soda the Isbeitarti, a Soda that has two concerns, like we said, Chaniya and Eretz Yisrael, and be mevatlet from Maestris. Gozu B'Rabbanon, they were geyser, even in Eretz Yisrael. But Batim, the last Butarti, Loi, Gozu B'Rabbanon. Gewaltig. Zog to Gemara, Ubesurya Moichin. In Surya, according to I skipped. Rabbi Yosy Omer, Eretz Yisrael maskirim lambatim. Rabbi Yosy is make when he holds even in Eretz Yisrael you're allowed to rent. It's only a soda that you're not allowed to rent. My time. What is the reason? Soda is the isbutarti. Soda is that has two reasons why you're not allowed to sell it to a guy. Goes Rubu Rabbanon. Rabbanon were geyser. Bottom. The last butarti. Bottom that only have one reason. Like goes Rubu Rabbanon. And that's why Rabbi Yosy allows you to rent a house to a guy in Eretz Yisrael. Ubesurya Moichin, Rabbi Yosy holds in Surya, you're even allowed to sell a house to a guy, my timer, because over Kibush Yachid Loish make Kibush. Rabbi Yosy holds that Surya is not legally part of Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, Soda the Isbatarti, Soda, where there's two concerns, Gozri Bu Rabbana. They were geyser Mechiras and Basurya. Atu Mechira Eretz Yisrael. So by Asada, they were geyser Mechira. But Batim, the last Buhutarte, Batim, there's only one concern, like Gozu B'Rabbanon, and they even, Rabbi Yosy even allowed you to sell a house to a guy in Surya. As he says in the Mishnah, Surya Moichin Batim, Umaskirin Sodos. Okay? Zog to Gemara weiter. In Chutzlart, Rabbi Yosy holds there's no restriction at all. You're allowed to sell them Sai Sodes and Sai Batim. My time, what's the svara? Why you're not geyser? By Surya he's geyser because Kiva the Merchak Eloi Gazrina. Surya is very, very close to Eretz Yisrael. But other places in Chutzlart, which are far away from Eretz Yisrael, there's no gzeira. And therefore you're allowed to sell them both houses and Sodes. Omer Vido Meshmul Halacha Rabbi Yosy. Passing like Rabbi Yosy, in fact, that you're allowed to sell a house to a guy out of Eretz Yisrael. Omer Rabbi Yosef, however, ubilvad shelo yasen a shchuna. A shchuna, the Gemara is going to tell us, v'kama shchuna, kana in shchuna pchusa mishlosha b'nei adam. You shouldn't sell 3 houses close together to a guy, even in Chutzlart, because you're creating a neighborhood, a Goyish neighborhood, and that's not appropriate in any Jewish neighborhood, even in Chutzlart. So even though you're allowed to sell a single home to a guy, don't sell them what we would call a neighborhood, meaning 3 different guys. That's not allowed. Zok to Gemara, if that's the case, so then even if you sell to one guy, it should be a problem. Because V'leichus Dilma Ha Yisrael Umazbin lachad oivet gechad, ve'ozol heich umazbin lahalatrei. You need to be, if you sell to one guy, this guy might subdivide his property into 3 properties. He'll keep one to himself, and the other 2 will sell to 2 individual guys. So now the one property that you sold has been subdivided into 3 properties, and now there's 3 guys there, and now you've created a shchuna. That's not allowed. Amar Abaye, we don't go so far to make our chashashish and upstairs. Alefnei mefkidina. If what you do directly leads to that to happen, you sell the three goyim, that would be a problem. Aval alifnei the lifnei loy mefkidina. But to be concerned that so many steps are going to happen, and that you're going to sell to one guy and he's going to sell to multiple goyim, that's not something that we're going to. So there's not really a lifnei the lifnei. Rashi just says it's just a term that the Gemara uses to describe. We're not choshish to such an extent that so much is going to happen. Gewaltig. Zog to Gemara weiter. Zog to Gemara weiter. Even in those places where we allow you to rent a house to a goy, you're not allowed to rent it for them to live in because they make themselves at home and they're reading their getchkas in there. That's not allowed. So Zog to Gemara, Michlau de ikaduchte d'loy mugri. If the Mishnah expresses itself that in a place where you're allowed to rent, it must be that there is a place where you're not allowed to rent. Now, according to Rabbi Yosy, anywhere you are allowed to rent. So Zog to Gemara Ustama, it must be that our Stam Mishnah here that says you're not allowed to rent to a goy to use as his dwelling. This is going to bring Avoda Zara in. Ustama, turning over on Talmud Beis, Kirab Meir. This is Pasha's going according to Reb Meir, who holds in Eretz Yisrael ein maskirin. So even where you are allowed to be maskir, like not in Eretz Yisrael, it's not leveis tira. According to Rabbi Yosy, why would the Mishnah say even in a place where you're allowed to rent? According to Rabbi Yosy, you're allowed to rent everywhere. So it must be that this restriction of not renting to a goy to use as a place to live, that would only be according to Reb Meir. Now, there's a lot of discussion. You can see there's a long Tosfos that discusses this problem of renting to a goy and he's going to bring his Avoda Zara in. So I just want to highlight that there's a lot of discussion about it, and he brings down from the Rabbeinu Yochanan that mepnei kisha amar Torah lo savi to'evel beisecha ikol memo you can learn lo osral bebeis hayisrael atzmai shudar b'seichai ba'oidai darboy. We're talking about a big house that the Yid rents out part of his house to a goy, so there the goy's mamish bringing To'eva into the Yid's house. However, v'afilu b'Eretz Yisrael come up in mezuzah sheichai ba'el b'veisai. Aval asoicher bayis af Eretz Yisrael is put them in a zuzah and a Torah, where abundant who the gozri shalei lahaskol of the chavim mepnei machnas asoicher b'Eretz Chavim. So Zog Tosfos v'hashta de davke b'otam masurim ladira of einam masurim ladira loy gozru. So you're allowed to rent other things to a goy. Okay, Zog to Gemara weiter. Uv'chol makom lo yiskar. In wherever you are, you're not allowed to rent it to him to be used as a living place because he's going to bring Avoda Zara. Tanya, we learned. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, lo yiskar adam merchatzai lo yivkachav. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the Dibur Maskal. The Dibur Maskal is you're never allowed to rent out of Beis HaMerchatz because it's always Nikra al Shem, the original owner, and people are going to think that this original owner is operating a Merchatz on Shabbos, and that's not allowed. So Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, lo yiskar adam merchatzai lo yivkachavim, the nation Nikra al Shemai. And the Ovid Gechavim Zeh, the guy that you're renting it to, he's going to be doing malacha in there on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and it's going to be my sign that the Yid's doing it. Zog to Gemara, Avalakuti Mai. So you're telling me to a goy dafka you're not allowed to rent, but you are allowed to rent your merchatz to a kuti. Break the Gemara. Shari would it be mutter? Zog to Gemara, kuti Eimer Ovid Bey Melacha B'Chayla Shalmoid. By a kuti, there's also a sign. Although a kuti keeps Shabbos, the kutim has not accepted Chalamoid as an Isser. As Rashi says, kuti lo Ovid Melacha B'Shabbos. if you rent him something on Shabbos, you don't have to be worried to operate your merchatz on Shabbos. But he will operate your merchatz. The Kutim are not concerned with halachas that are learned out of a drash, and therefore they will be over. So how could you rent a kuti? Zok Gemara, what's the problem with operating a merchatz on Chalamoid? And Nanami, if a Yid himself of Dinan is allowed to operate a merchatz on Chalamoid, it's l'tzarech moed. People have to wash. So Oibazoi, what's the concern about renting to a kuti? Zok Gemara, so kuti Emar Ave be Melacha b'Chalamoid, Chalamoid and Nanami Adin, and therefore there's no problem renting a merchatz to a kuti. It's only to a goy where there's a chash that the goy will operate a merchatz on Shabbos. So you're not allowed to rent a merchatz to a goy because the goy is going to work in a merchatz on Shabbos, and people are going to think that he's operating a merchatz. What about a field? If you rent a field to a goy, the goy is going to do malacha on Shabbos, and people are going to think it's your field that's doing malacha. My shari, it's mutter to rent to a guy. Zok Gemara, my time. What's the reason? Because arisuse kavit. If someone's working in a field, people don't necessarily assume that the owner's working in the field or he's paying somebody by the hour to work in the field. They might think that he's an aris because most of the arrangements for employees working in the field is that they're working in the field, they get a portion of proceeds. So they're not working for the owner. They're working for themselves. And therefore, if a Yid has someone working in the field, no one's going to think that the Yid's worker is working in the field. Everyone's going to assume it's an Aris. And the Aris is allowed to work in the field on Shabbos because the Aris is working for himself. As Rashi says, you're allowed to rent a field to a guy in Chutz La'aretz. Even though the field is still called Yankel's field, so if it's called Yankel's field, people are going to see work going on in the field on Shabbos. No one will be chosh in Yankel violating Shabbos. No one's going to think that the guy is a shliach for the Yid and that the Yid is doing an avla. Ella, how will they understand what's going on? They'll say that the guy working in that field is merely a sharecropper. The kibla love lemechta l'shlish u'lervia. So this is like a contract worker who's allowed to work. He's working for himself. He's allowed to work on Shabbos. So that's why you're allowed to sell, or you're allowed to rent a field to a guy, because no one's going to be choshed that the Yid has hired a guy to work on Shabbos. So my time, arisa arusa sekov. So Frank Gemara, why would you condemn somebody if you see his merchatz being operated on Shabbos? Why wouldn't you assume the same thing, that it's an oris working the merchatz? He's working for a share of the profits of the merchatz. Merchatz nami amri arisa arisu sekov. And therefore you should allow me to rent it to a guy because no one's going to be choshed that it's mine and I'm hiring a guy to work. Zok to Gemara arisa the merchatz le'avdi. You have to go according to what the norms of society are. The normal arrangement of somebody working in a field is arisus. So therefore, there's no marasayin because everyone's not going to assume that I'm hiring a guy to work on Shabbos. Everyone's going to assume there's an arisus here, and that's perfectly allowed. But when people operate a merchatz, it's not the normal way to hire an aris to run your merchatz. The normal way the merchatz gets operated is the owner operates it, and he hires employees. So therefore, when someone sees people working in a merchatz on Shabbos, he will rightfully assume that the Yid hired employees. And therefore, you're not allowed to rent to a goy because people will think that the Yid hired employees. Gewaltig. Now, there's a big shaila here. Nowadays, are you allowed to rent to a goy? So you can see there's a very long Tosfos. So I just want to touch on some small details in this Tosfos. So Zok Tosfos, right at the beginning, Pasuk Rabbeinu Tam Alocha Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. We paskin like Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. The Omar Arisa Arisuse Kovet. Therefore, you're allowed to rent fields to a goy. Mitechach hitter Yisrael shenosan beisai lasoised bekablonus livnois boy afilu b'shabbos. He allowed a yid, if he hired a goy bekablonus, he allowed the goy to continue to work on Shabbos, because normally people don't pay hourly employees to build a house. They normally give it to a contractor, and it's a contract. The Kavachimer Namihu, it's a Kavachimer. The Hashta Arisus Soda, Shechelek HaYisrael Mashpiach V'Malach Shari, Madach, you can allow a guy to do a risus on the field on Shabbos, where although the guy is working for himself, but he's actually improving the field that belongs to the Yid. Kablonu she'in bo shvach liYisrael klal b'ma she'memayir hanochri lasois kablonusai. If it's just building a house where the Yid does not benefit by the speed in which the Kabbalah does it, therefore, surely the name of Kablona Kablonuse Kabbalah. There for sure there would be a head. And that's how Rabbeinu Tam said, I guess if there's not an issue of Chil Hashem, you are allowed to let a Goya Kabbalah do work on Shabbos. But there's a long Tosfos about it. So if you look towards the bottom of Tosfos, where it says Ad Kan Shitas Rabbeinu Tam, Tosfos quotes Deri. Rabbi Yitzchak Pirsh, the Kabbalah the Bais Osher, he holds it's Osher, while you doichel kol rayis, and he was doichel all of the rayis of Rabbeinu Tam. So you can see that there's a big machlokes as to whether or not you would allow the Kabbalahs of a guy. If a guy took on the contract, would he be allowed to finish it, to do the work on Shabbos? Okay, Gevaldik. Let's see the Gemara a little bit weiter. Tanya, we learned in the price. Rav Shimon ben Elazar Omer. Shimon ben Elazar says, Lo yaskir odom sadeya lakuti. A person should not rent his field out to a kuti, because the sod is nekras al shemoy, and the kuti zeh oiseh b'ay malacha v'chaylo shemoy, and the kuti will do malacha in his field on chalamoy. Zok to Gemara, aval ovid kechavim my shari, and ovid kechavim you are allowed to rent a field to a guy. Why are you allowed to rent a field to a guy? Are we not concerned that the guy is going to do malacha and will think that the Yid's hiring him? No, the army arisa of him. By a guy will say that the guy was an aris. So for the Gemara, Yachi Kuti Nami, Amri Arisa Arisuse of him. So why wouldn't we allow you to rent your field to a kuti? No one's going to think that you're being over. Everyone's going to look at the kuti. He's doing an isser, and he's doing arisus, but you're not doing any isser. So why would there be a problem of renting a field to a kuti if there's no chash marasayin? Because we'll say arisa arisuse bit. And for the Gemara, let's turn on to Amar Aleph, Rabbeinu Amar Aleph. Dr. Gemara, Arisusa, Rab Shimon ben Elazar, lastly. Rab Shimon ben Elazar holds you don't have this svara of Arisusa, and therefore there's a chash of Marasai. So Frank the Gemara said, then let's go back to a goy. So why does Rab Shimon ben Elazar allow you to rent a field to a goy if he doesn't hold the Arisusa? Gemara Damrinan lay B'tzayis, because you'll tell him don't use the field on Shabbos. Don't work the field on Shabbos, and he'll listen. Right to Gemara. Kuti nami amrina levitzayis. The kuti as well. Tell him don't work on my field on Shabbos. Put it into the contract. Like tomorrow, kuti leitzayis. A kuti won't listen. So why will a goy listen to you when you tell him not to work on Shabbos? And the kuti won't. The Amar he says anog amirnot feminach. What you think you Jew are a big paisik? I also know what halach is, and I know that you're a lot of work on. I know you're a lot of work on Shabbos, and therefore, since I know you're a lot of work on Shabbos, we're afraid he won't listen to the Eid. Let's see Rashi. He doesn't hold of this whole story. Why do we say kuti? The mashma ha'ibit kachav mishari, it's mashma that you would be able to rent your field to a guy. Lav taima mishum arisusa. It's not because there's no maris ayin, because everyone assumes it's an oris, because Reb Shimon ben Elazar does not hold of that svara. We will tell the guy, the renter, do not do any malach on Shabbos. Put that into the contract, it's size, and you could rely that the guy will listen and not work in the field on Shabbos. So, frankly, what's the whole concern that a kuti will work in the field on Chalamoid? Why won't he listen? Zok to Gemara, because a kuti doesn't listen because he thinks he knows better. Do Amar Anag Gamirna Tvemina. Frankly, Gemara Ihachi. My area of reputation across Al Shemai, Reb Shimon ben Elazar said the reason why you can't rent the field to a guy, to a kuti, is because it's nikras Al Shemai, which sounds like it's a Maris Ayin Dika reason, but it's not. If you're actually concerned that the kuti is going to work in the field in Chalamoid, so you're being machshul the kuti in the Avera. So the reason should be out lifnei iver, never mind because of Maris Ayin. In fact, you're right. There's two reasons here. First of all, if you rent a field to a kuti and he's going to work it on the Chalamoid, there's an Isser lifnei iver. The oid ka'amar, and as well, the oid mifnei nekras al shamoy. But it also shtickle looks like Maris Ayin because people see that your field is being worked on Chalamoid, and they're not going to assume that it's an Aris. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we were zeichen to finish Daf Chof Aleph, and Be'ez Hashem tomorrow we will learn Daf Chof Beis. Once again, I will still be on Zoom tomorrow morning. Be'ez Hashem, Friday morning, I hope to be back in Shul, in person. Everybody should have an awesome, wonderful day.
Yeah.
Shkoyach.